Yeah, thanks for joining. So my name is Derek Gruen. I'm a lab leader with People's Economy Lab, joined by some great guests here. We're going to have a hopefully a really interesting conversation today about an issue that's, on the front pages of all our newspapers, on the front of mine as we try to fix a broken economy. So thanks for joining us. So we are at People's Economy Lab Lunch Labs. And we've been doing this series just for a few weeks, or a few months rather. I think we've had 4 or 5 sessions, and we're happy to be kind of trying some new things as we go along. But first, let me make sure you all know who you are. Okay, it looks like I'm going to keep admitting folks, so you're going to see me slightly distracted as I do that. But you are here with People's Economy Lab. We envision an economy that serves people instead of people serving the economy. We do this through identifying, co-creating, making the case for better economic models, and convening leaders in our field, like all of you, to build momentum for an economy that puts people first. And as I mentioned, this is our lunch lab space. We've done some really interesting lunch labs in the past on community wealth building, on collaborative governance, on some local models to build, retain generational wealth through assets, on community organizing and resistance. And in this lunch lab, we're going to be exploring this issue of, you know, new taxes on the rich and how we really wrestle with the problem of kind of moving wealth and building an economy that's both, dependent on that transfer of wealth and also resilient to um, wealth, not dependent on necessarily people with a lot of wealth to have a just economy. So it should be an interesting conversation. For now, I would love it if you could introduce yourself in the chat. If you could share your name and pronoun, any organizational affiliation, and just anything that drew you to this conversation today. We'd love to hear who's in the room so we can help tailor our comments to this audience. We welcome you to be on camera if you're not, actively chewing on something. It is lunchtime, so feel free to have lunch. That's kind of the idea. It's a casual conversation. It's not too formal, but we will have some opportunity for a discussion as part of this. So please, be thinking about anything you'd like to add to the conversation as we go along. So, yeah, we'll look for you, for folks to introduce themselves for the chat, and I'll keep going here as well. I want to introduce our guests today. And we have a couple guests who I'm really excited to hear from. First, Ryan Watt is the Executive Director of Economic Opportunity Institute. He previously worked as the executive director of The Urbanist, a Seattle-based advocacy journalism organization, as a strategy lead for international large-scale change for community solutions, a national homeless nonprofit, and as a senior analyst in public policy research. He also serves on the board of FutureWise, which is a statewide land use organization, and an implementation board of the King County Regional Homeless Authority. So welcome, Ryan. Thanks for being here. Excited to hear from you. And we have Christine Hanna, who I've known for quite a while, has done many things. We first worked together in the context of the Sightline Institute, and then reconnected a few years later in the context of the Seattle Good Business Network, where she had envisioned this idea for a local economy leaders lab, would kind of bring forth new ideas about how to build more democratic, just, and strong local economic models in Seattle. So that is the kind of the previous iteration, the vision that we're still building from here at the People's Economy Lab. So really grateful for Christine for being here and for that vision that helped bring us all here today. She is also the executive director at Yes Magazine and is the founder and principal at Cassidia at Impact Consulting. He's doing a lot of cool work we'll get to hear about today. So one thing you'll notice about both of these speakers is they have, background in journalism. They are, following the issues at a high level. They've been thinking about the narratives that help shape our decision making on our economy, whether it's in policies or the models we use to build prosperity. They're big picture thinkers, but they're engaged from slightly different lenses and different roles. And I think they both bring kind of a spirit of practicality, but also kind of radical visionaries. So that's why I'm excited to hear from them. And yeah, before we go any further, anything, and I'll stop sharing the screen. Christine or Ryan, I missed you want to add that was good context about what brings you here today.
I'll just say one, thank you for having me, but also I have two colleagues here on the call today, Helena Polito and Annie Cook, who are two of our great policy associates at EOI. And most of my job is taking the things that they research and write and saying them out loud to other audiences. So Annie and Helen, thanks for being here. And if you want to jump in or add anything, please do.
It's nice to have that camaraderie. Um, I guess I would just say I was sharing this with Derek the other day. I grew up at sort of the tail end of the Cold War, and really, and then ended up studying economic systems. One moment, but sort of communism and socialism, capitalism, et cetera, both in college and through traveling. And ultimately this landed on that inherently markets aren't good or bad. It's really how are they designed, and to what degree are they serving communities versus serving extractive purposes or concentrating wealth. And that question about how do you design them better has really kind of driven my career through Sightline and the other places that Derek has mentioned. So it's kind of an anchor for me. I'm really happy to be here. It's been a while since I've spoken publicly about these topics. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Christine. Thanks so much for being here. We're excited for this. So we're going to get into some conversation. First, we're going to ask both Ryan and Christine to kind of ground us in the conversation we're going to have by introducing some core concepts and just bringing us up to date on where we are in Washington State on, our kind of tax policy and also how we're moving towards a new economy. So, why this conversation? People's Economy Lab has used as an organizing framework, a just transition framework, which is just a conceptual model to think about how we move from the economy we know, which is driving a lot of poor outcomes, to the economy we know we need. And key strategy there is about how we move money. So that's one piece of it. And it's also about how we navigate the contradictions. We know there's kind of in aspiring to an economy that's different from where we are today. We actually have to live in the economy of today. So a lot of this work is actually figuring out, how we deal with these contradictions and stay true and aligned to a North Star. Why now? Obviously, there's been a lot of policy progress in recent years, and as part of that progress, we see pushback, we see tension on and resistance to change and calling into question what our economy is really rooted in. If we're, challenging some of the wealthiest people to pay more, pay their fair share, and they threaten to leave, how are we going to navigate that? How are we going to show what's possible? So in this conversation, we're going to touch on a lot of, some of the policy factors, some of the different economic models, but we're also going to dig deep into kind of the narratives that shape the conversation, whether it's kind of this Robin Hood ideas about how, taxing the rich, whether it's about equity ideas about the systemic barriers that drive outcomes for different people in our community, whether it's about kind of the safety net of public good, or whether it's other narratives that may be probably less popular on here, like, the grind, the individual need to kind of game the system just to get by, or the job creators narrative around, who's creating wealth and how that trickles down or grows from the bottom up. So, without further, prefacing comments, I'm going to turn it over to hear a little bit from Ryan and Christine. Ryan, I was hoping you would start just by kind of grounding us in the current moment of, what is happening with this kind of tax the rich movement and what progress have we made and what we should be thinking about to start.
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. I really love the work that you all do, and it's really wonderful to get to be here. Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are with the state budget and with taxes, because a lot has happened in the last not just year, but 5 months. Um, but I also want to recognize that there's a lot of expertise on this call and a lot of people and we're a relatively small group, a lot of people who know what they're talking about. So if at any point someone wants to jump in with a question or a comment, let me know, and we'll get into it. So I think it is helpful in talking about what just happened with the millionaire's tax in Washington, which is probably the biggest single change to our tax code in over 90 years, to ground ourselves in how we got here, why our tax code is the way it is. And although I know many of you have worked on this issue for some time, some of you may be new to tax policy. So I wanted to start with two really basic facts about Washington State's tax and budget that I think underpin a lot of the conversation. One of them is that we have a structural budget deficit in Washington State. That means that over time, we are increasingly unable to invest in the things that we know lower costs for working families: childcare, healthcare, paid leave, all of the things that lower costs for folks. So, thing number one is we have a structural budget deficit. Thing number two is we have an extraordinarily regressive tax code, which means that the rich pay the least as a share of their income in taxes, and the rest of us are left to pick up the tab. In fact, up until this year, we had the second most regressive tax code in the country, behind only Florida. And although I don't mean any disrespect to the fine people of Florida, I think our ambitions can be a little bit higher than just beating them. Uh, so those two facts, I think, are the most important things to know if you know anything about our state tax code. And to understand them, it's helpful to understand why we have the tax code we have, where we're not keeping up with what we need to invest in families, and we're asking the rich to pay far less as a share of their income in taxes than the rest of us. This all goes back to the 1930s. So for the first 50 years of the state's colonial history, or rather like history after colonization, um, the state tax code was largely reliant on property taxes. And that was because the way most people held wealth in the state was in the form of large farms. And therefore, a tax on property was a fairly reasonable way to tax the wealth that existed in the state. Over the course of the 50 years from the 1880s to the 1930s, cities sprang up, including Seattle, where I live, along the Sound and mostly in the western part of the state, and a more financialized economy emerged that wasn't as reliant on property and was much more reliant on income for generating wealth. Pair that growing situation where there was this large amount of income being generated and not being taxed with the Great Depression taking off in 1929. And by the early 1930s, you had a situation where the property tax base was collapsing. And also the folks, largely landowners in the eastern part of the state who were carrying the burden of the state's tax structure, started feeling like it would be really great if we taxed, for example, the bankers in Seattle instead of them. And so there was a large, really mass popular movement to introduce a state income tax, and not only a state personal income tax, but a state corporate income tax. And both of these were put in place by the people of this state. Unfortunately, shortly after they were put in place, the state Supreme Court struck down that income tax and that corporate income tax on the basis of the decision that income was property, and property, based on the state constitution, has to be taxed at a uniform rate. So they struck down both of these income taxes. More on that later. This left the legislature in a huge problem because they didn't have the property tax revenue, but they also didn't have the income tax revenue that they've been counting on. And so, in one legislative session in 1935, we basically built the state tax code we have today, which is a gross receipts tax on business called the B&O tax, a sales tax across a wide range of largely goods at that point, but now goods and services. And yes, that's still that property tax. And that tax code, which was intended to be a temporary stopgap until they figured out how to get the income tax back, is basically the tax code we had up until this year, March of 2026, where our state budget is about 50% sales tax revenue, about 20% business and occupation tax, about 15% property tax, and the rest a variety of largely other excise taxes or taxes on transactions. And the problem with that is that the economy today looks really, really different than the economy looked in the mid 1930s in a number of different ways. For one thing, we are buying and selling a lot of things that aren't just goods in the way that they largely were in the 30s. And so there's a whole category of economic events that aren't being taxed. In another, because we continue to rely on property tax, which after a variety of changes are capped in their growth. which means that they're not keeping up with the cost of the states doing business. And lastly, because we are so heavily reliant on sales tax for the most part, we're in a circumstance where, again, before this last legislative session, the lowest 20% of earners in Washington state were paying about 14% of their income in taxes, while the top 1% were paying about 4%. 14% for the lowest 20%, 4% for the top 1%, which is just crazy and morally inexcusable. And that's what we mean by a regressive tax code. So this was the situation that we were in prior to this legislative session. We had made some progress with the passage of the statewide capital gains tax, which I know some people on this call were really involved in. But we were still in a circumstance where our structural budget deficit was growing, and we were one of the most regressive tax codes in the country. And so this is why the millionaires tax fight was so important, because it was a fight to impose a 9.9% tax on all income over $1 million, which is by itself enough to bring in billions of dollars a year for K-12 education, for healthcare, for all those things that matter. But it's also an opportunity to test at the state Supreme Court that ruling that they put in place in the 1930s that said that income is property. Even at the time, this was kind of a shaky a ruling. There were only a few other states that designated income as property, but all of those states have repealed that designation or taken it off the books since then. So we're the only state that says income is property. And so what we expect to happen now is this case will be challenged at the state Supreme Court. That's already happening. And we expect a ruling from that court on this question of whether income is property. If the court rules that income is not property and therefore it doesn't have to be taxed uniformly, that opens the door to really transforming the state's tax code to fix both of the problems I mentioned. So I've been going on for a while, so I'm going to stop talking there, but hopefully that's what you're looking for, Derek, and the hopeful grounding and why this legislative session was so important.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Ryan. So there's fundamentally we obviously need public revenues for education system, et cetera. At the same time, our tax system plays this important role of redistribution when we have such great disparities in income, as well as things that have passed more recently, like capital gains and wealth. So there's kind of a couple of key functions that we're trying to address, and at the same time, as we think about our economy, we're trying to build prosperity for everyone. And Christine, you've worked on kind of how do we build a more democratic economy and how do we build wealth, even kind of in the pre-redistribution phase. I'm wondering if you could, talk a little bit about that. And I know you have some slides to kind of ground us in that work.
Yeah, great. Ryan, that was super helpful. I knew some of that, but not all of that. So I'm going to share my screen. I do have a handful of slides that do get at this sort of, kind of higher level, long term. Where could we actually go? And how do we move ourselves in that direction, even as we're working with what we have now? Okay, so. All right, can you all see that? Great. Okay, cool. So I think we'll just go ahead and sort of jump right in. I mean, I mentioned that I'm looking at this from sort of a higher level and kind of where are we looking to go. I think probably a lot of folks in this call are familiar with the idea of sort of systems level approach or systems change approach, where rather than trying to sort of make an existing system less bad or to mitigate the impacts of a system that doesn't function well for anything, whether you're talking about a manufacturing system or a policy system, an economy. There are different points, in that system that you can intervene to make it actually create the results that you want. So we're looking for solutions and models that are more upstream in the system, so a higher level systems approach rather than a mitigation approach. And here are a bunch of terms that if you've been hanging out with the People's Economy Lab folks, you would be somewhat familiar with, or of course, there's lots of books and other publications, including Yes Media, that you may be familiar with that capture different aspects of what that might look like, what an economy that actually serves people on the planet and communities better than generating huge piles of money in the hands of individual people or institutions. And the term that I have kind of come to, I've used all these terms at different points in time. What I'm kind of working with now and who knows if it'll stick, we'll see, is the idea of a regenerative economy. And part of the reason I like this is because it captures not only kind of a future that we might want to see that is generative in nature, but that it also is restoring and healing along the way because our current model has kind of screwed the pooch in a lot of ways. So, so this is kind of systems level approach. The term I've been using is regenerative economy. And if you contrast sort of our current extractive economy model, capitalism, extractive capitalism model, people call it neoliberalism, there's lots of different terms. But anyway, our current model with the principles of a regenerative economy, you get a really different picture of what are the kind of underlying motivations that are operating that generate the results that we have in the current system and the kinds of results that we would like to see in a healthier system. So I'm just going to kind of run through some of these. I'm doing this quickly. So extractive capitalism, obviously, it's about profit maximization. It's built into the law. It's built into so many aspects of how capitalism works, versus a regenerative economy, which is about well-being for people, for communities, for future generations, for the planet, over profit. Private ownership and extraction versus community ownership and stewardship. Growth is the goal, like always. There's not a business out there who will tell you that they can't. I mean, there's an axiom: if you don't grow, you die, which in some cases is true, but in a lot of cases it's not true. In the case of extractive capitalism, growth is eating and exploiting all along the way. So versus resilience and sufficiency. Externalizing costs, whether it's pollution or oppression or having taxation or philanthropy pay for things like healthcare and homelessness and so forth. The existing system really externalizes many costs versus internalizing costs, or at least mitigating them at the outset rather than leaving them for other people or future generations to clean up. Extractive capitalism really rewards and idealizes individual competition versus collective care and cooperation. And then there's a really short-term focus versus a long-term focus. So the idea of, to maximize things now and, long-term is long-term. We don't have to, it's really about us right here, right now, versus the idea of intergenerational health and well-being. And then nature is a resource to use and to exploit versus nature as a partner. So imagine, I mean, these are really design principles. We have choices here. There's nothing that says we have to go down the path of extractive capitalism, but it's very entrenched, as we all know. There's all kinds of ways culturally, from a narrative perspective, from a obviously from an existing wealth holding perspective. It's an extremely entrenched system. And the question is, how do you get from one to the other? There are lots and lots of examples out there of businesses, initiatives, community projects, and some infrastructure to support those things that are really working on the principles, or at least some of the principles of a regenerative economy. And I pulled a few examples from Yes magazine, which as an organization is no longer exist, but the archive is being maintained by Truth Out. So you can still access all of these articles. And if at some point people want access to the links to these sources, I'm happy to pull them. So there are proof points, models across lots of different sectors. In sort of one model within kind of the enterprise sectors about worker ownership. We're all familiar with that. A couple of quick examples: Common Ground Cafe in Baltimore. We have many co-ops here in Washington State. And then Mondragon in Spain, which is a collective of over 100 businesses within the Mondragon cooperative network, 80,000 workers. The area where many of these businesses are has the lowest poverty rate in Spain. And one of the things I love about this model is that those businesses, part of their revenue goes toward a seed fund that self-funds new co-ops and supports Mondragon University to help train people in the development of cooperatives. Affordable housing, one of the key models, obviously, is the Community Land Trust. Especially effective in places where there has been some sort of disaster or crisis and there's rebuilding that needs to happen. where they're really designing and building in a different way and building for resilience. These are just a few examples from one of the articles in Florida, Houston, and then of course in Seattle, the Homestead Community Land Trust. Energy democracy. This is an example out of Puerto Rico called Casa Pueblo, which is there was a community solar microgrid um, operation that was in place and very kind of like, small and, little bits here and there and supporting different people who wanted to communities that wanted to make that happen. And then after Hurricane Maria, it became the only power available, and they had some funding to ramp up what they were doing, and they continued over time to build that. And so community microgrids are now an important part of the energy system there. Sorry. And then land stewardship. This is another one where we're talking about farmland trusts or land back movements where a collective of people are coming together to really steward a piece of land um, with the idea of both restoring it to its most sort of natural productive state and also for food, for shelter. This is an example in California called Shelterwood Collective, which is really it's a beautiful article if you have a chance to take a look at it, where they are not only working with the land to restore it and have it be productive shelter for people, in particular Indigenous, Black, and LGBTQ communities, but also to build kind of community sovereignty together and really a safe place for groups that are have otherwise been excluded or exploited. So a few examples, there are proof points across lots of different sectors. So there's plenty of evidence that the models work, and there's plenty of evidence that the existing system is horrible for so many reasons. But the question that's on my mind is why are these models still the exception? Because it's not because there aren't enough people who share the values. It's not because we don't have the ideas and even the examples, but in my mind, what we really lack is infrastructure. Because when you think about what makes it easy to operate within the existing system is all of the different infrastructure that exists there. So here are a few examples of what I mean. Incubators for these new models are really rare. So the example in Baltimore that I mentioned, there's an organization called BREAD. I can't remember what it stands for, but it serves all of Baltimore. They have helped bring about well over 100 cooperatives there, many of them from existing owners who wanted to move the ownership to their employees. They were ready to retire. The silver tsunami uh, dynamic that's happening all around the country. But incubators for these models are really rare. Lots of places don't have robust land trust operations. We're lucky that we do here in Seattle, but many places don't. So there's all kinds of issues around just not having the kind of technical assistance available to folks who might want to do these initiate these projects. The legal and financial expertise is really scarce. So most lawyers and lenders, title companies, et cetera, like they know how to do the things they know how to do that support the existing system, and that's what they're asked to do 99% of the time. So they either don't or won't or can't really work with land trusts and co-ops and other kinds of hybrid or alternative models of ownership and alternative models of financial decision making because they're really focused on risk versus return and what that model looks like. So it's difficult for them to even support people who want to invest in these other options. Um, Patient mission-aligned capital is just chronically scarce. Um, Seed Commons is an incredible fund that is doing lots of stuff to support the development of co-ops around the country. It's remarkable, but it's also an absolute drop in the bucket in terms of what's needed. Um, and then all of the frameworks that we kind of swim within are really built for the conventional model. And it's not just about the legal and financial aspects, it's about policy, the policy levers that we have more available to us and what seems like the obvious and lowest hanging fruit to work on. It's about narrative systems, it's about culture. I mean, and it's also about all kinds of issues around, where you live, who you grew up with, whether you are an immigrant or whether you're born here, what color your skin is, or all those barriers on top of. So it takes an incredible, it's a heroic effort to get these models and pilots up and running and sustained because it requires a level of passion and commitment that is hard for many people to sustain, even if they want to participate. And so the bottleneck in my mind largely is about infrastructure. There's lots of cultural aspects to it as well, but if we had the infrastructure, we would be able to move the needle, and then there'd be more examples that people would be experiencing in their day-to-day life that would help shift that culture and narrative. So here's my idea about like how do we get there? There's something called the Washington Cultural Access Tax, which allows communities to tax. It's a regressive system, which I don't like that part of it, but allows communities to tax certain activities, and that money goes straight into a fund that supports arts and culture. And my idea here is, what if the tax revenue from extreme wealth was explicitly directed toward building the infrastructure for the new models, as opposed to just shoring up, which is obviously also necessary, shoring up the basic services that we deal with in Washington State with regard to the structural deficits that Ryan mentioned. So basically, a directed tax, carving off some of the excess wealth to support infrastructure that could allow these models to replicate more easily. So that's what I'm sort of curious about. I'd love to explore a conversation around that here or otherwise. And this is my email address. If anybody has any interesting ideas or knows of projects that are going on that you think I might like to know about, please get in touch. That is all.
Thanks so much, Christine, and Ryan. So, we have a couple big issues, a number of big issues we're dealing with here, which you heard from Ryan and Christine. One is this kind of regressive tax system built for another era that has allowed, income and wealth to concentrate and create the disparities. The other is the system of creating wealth, which is, being underinvested in, perhaps, as Christine illustrated, where, again, wealth is kind of concentrating and we're not maybe building wealth from the ground up in the way we want, and the distribution is not where we want. And here we are today. People are quite concerned about their economy and their economic security. Affordability is, a top issue on the polls, whether it's housing or food. I think there's a headline, maybe it's today, that grocery store prices were up 5% since the previous April, right? Which is a pretty big jump. People are more willing to consider taxes on the rich. We have interest in the kind of ideas that Christine was outlining around people wanting more control over more democratic systems of in our economy. And yet, we still have the situation where the job creator narrative exists, where we still feel dependent on the rich and kind of resources trickling down. And we have kind of Howard Schultz thumbing his nose at Seattle and writing op-eds. And it's tough not to take debate that we're dependent on his wealth, right, and riches, and Starbucks kind of threatening to leave, kind of thing. So, I'm going to ask a couple questions of Christine and Ryan to get started, and then we're going to invite everyone in. But, to what degree, I guess, considering that background information, what degree are we, tied to the rich? Is our economic security tied to the rich? Is that a transition strategy? Is it an end in themselves? How do we think about actually ultimately arriving in this more just economy? Any thoughts?
Just some simple questions for our last 24 minutes. There's so much in there that I'm not even going to attempt to sort of tackle it holistically, but I do want to tease out a tension that has been on my mind lately, which is the tension between two frames for taxes. One frame is of taxes as punishment, and this is a means for redistribution of wealth. And another frame is of taxes as our shared stake in society. And where I think that tension arises is in that many people, myself included, view taxes on the rich as both valuable as a mechanism for drawing revenue into systems that desperately need it, but also as valuable as an end into themselves. We know that there are social implications of vast wealth inequality. It is socially corrosive to have people making orders of magnitude more than others and have orders of magnitude more even than that in accrued wealth. And so I think there is significant value just in the redistributive aspect in taxes on wealth and taxes on high income. The worry there, the concern there that I have, even while being supportive, very supportive of those things, is that that leads us into a frame where we see taxes and taxation as punishment rather than, again, as our shared stake in society, something that we all contribute into the world that we want to live. And I think we're starting to see the negative impacts of that already in some Democratic Party messaging around taxes, where we have Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez saying we should exempt police officers from income tax on their first 100,000, where we see Democratic senators on the East Coast saying we should exempt all people from income tax on their first 100,000, or carving out special favored groups to protect from taxation. And they're doing it within a frame of affordability, and they're doing it within a frame of tax the rich. And I think that really is leading us down a dangerous path where we are picking and choosing who gets to opt in to being a part of society. And so, what I'm thinking about is both how do we make sure that our systems work for everyone, which will require a stake for everyone, and also how do we combat this corrosive effect um, of gross wealth inequality, and I mean gross in both senses of the word. The last thing I'll say is uh, I think that some of the resistance that we're seeing within, broadly speaking, left spaces, though obviously the Democratic Party doesn't encompass the whole left or vice versa, to taxation on the middle class, comes from a deeply felt belief from many, many people that government simply isn't delivering on the things that matter to them. And I think, as someone who believes deeply in government and the power of government to do good in the world, it's incumbent on us to make that better and to recognize the places where we have made it too hard to act, to deliver, to make meaningful difference in people's lives. And I said before everyone jumped on to just Christine and Derek that I was really hoping Christine would go before me for all these answers, because I think her type of expansive thinking is exactly what we need to be engaging more in as we think about how to deliver on that fundamental mismatch between people's hopes for the society they live in and the society that they actually experience day to day.
Boy, I really glad you brought that up, Ryan, about the idea of taxes as a punishment versus, in some ways, I mean, the way I interpret it is sort of it's sort of a civic responsibility. It's something that we do as part of participating in the broader civic experiment of how do we live together, how do we take care of each other, how to make sure people don't fall through the cracks.
That's right.
Because there will be disparity in any system, right? And I want to be clear about that. Like, I'm not someone who believes that, we can, that everybody will always be equal, because different people have different needs and ideas about what's possible. And some people have certain kinds of initiative and so forth. It's just there will always be some level of disparity. What we have right now is so extreme and vulgar, that it is so out of whack. And the way I think about this right now is that it can't be the end game, right? I do think of it in some ways as a transition. So it's, um, you know, taxing it as quickly as possible and ultimately as little as possible, because we don't want to, when I say little, I don't mean like not enough, not very much. What I mean by that is we want to get to a place where that kind of disparity does not it doesn't require this kind of taxation where we need to basically, grab as much of that big pile of money as possible to support people from falling through the cracks. So I see it as a transition, as a necessary part of an important transition. But if it becomes the end goal, then we have a lot. We're just perpetuating a system that will constantly be under attack by, shifting political currents. It will be, I mean, we've been living with this regressive tax system now for nearly 100 years, right? And finally, we have a little bit of wind at our back, and maybe it will get turned over, the what Ryan was talking about earlier, as far as income being property. Maybe that will get overturned, and we'll actually have a window to be able to have a more progressive tax system, which would get to Ryan's point about it being a shared commitment. Um, but I don't think we can ignore the opportunity right now that we have. We have to do this now. And I would like to see it support the transition to the next thing, because if people don't see and experience what that next thing can be, then they have nothing to turn toward. People don't like risk. They're not going to step away from something that feels comfortable, even if wouldn't have felt comfortable for them 20 years ago. We're remarkably good at adapting to things. We're like frogs in the pot of hot water. So I really do feel like there needs to be attention put on, if we're serious about it, there needs to be attention to the infrastructure that allows these models to replicate so that people actually have alternatives to look at rather than swimming around 98% of the time in the bad model. They need to experience swimming around in the good model.
Thanks to you both. And we're going to let you all weigh in. Actually, I'm going to put up a quick poll, see if I can do this to see what you think of this question. Should we be worried about people earning a million or more a year saying goodbye to Seattle? You can take a moment to do that poll. And actually, if anyone has a kind of wants to jump on the mic and share their immediate reaction, if you've been thinking about this question, now's a good time. We'll probably just do one comment for now, but we'll have more. You want to respond to this? We get no yeses so far. Interesting. Oh, we shouldn't be worried. Plenty of maybes.
Is that right? Nobody said yes.
No, not so far.
Would someone be willing to share why they said no?
If there was not a maybe option, maybe I would have said yes. I don't know.
Still thinking it through, huh? Yeah, it's tough. All right. Well, if
Well,
no one wants
I
to,
think we,
yeah,
yeah,
good.
I'll jump in. Thanks. I think we've grown dependent on this Faustian bargain between um, wealth and repair. And as you said, that narrative shift Derek talked about, the job creation narrative, which is false but easy to believe. We need a narrative more like what Ryan, Christine, you shared more cooperative economies and more small local businesses. So I think the dependence on large corporations has uh, um, created a dependency on this unsustainable model. So I stand confidently behind my no. But open, would love to hear a contrarian view.
Thanks so much,
I mean, I
David.
could think of an argument for a yes. I think we all line around like we don't want to see our cities dominated by right people with wealth whose interests are outside of the collective, but do think that right our society is currently dependent and sort of addicted to a system. So it's sort of like removing the sort of drug from a system that's addicted to that system will cause reaction. And so I more fear the reactionary response by folks saying that we're dependent on this system. This is how we see the world. When we see all the millionaires leave, that's proof that this doesn't work and that our world will collapse and that sort of creates withdrawals from the system. And the withdrawals can often be more damaging themselves than actually weaning right the person off the thing they're addicted to. So I think about like that phenomenon, how the body of our society is deeply ingrained in the system. And oftentimes, right, I think a gradual process similar to like an addict can be more healthy than just removing everything. So yeah, that's what I fear is really the reactionary response.
Thanks for giving Yeah, and it's worth pointing out too, at this point, and Ryan can probably speak to this better than I, but the research shows that like these types of taxes have not actually, led to a super substantial effect in terms of actual departures. A lot of it is rhetoric, but you could imagine a place that it could get there. And yeah, Ryan, if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said here. This conversation drives me slightly crazy because it's always framed in sort of airy hypotheticals. Aren't you concerned that rich people, non-specified, might leave? And then you'll occasionally get folks like Howard Schultz writing their op-eds about how they're cranky and they wanted to go. And you very rarely get people making over $1 million going about their life, writing a full page op-ed in the Times saying, I actually am fine and I'm staying. Like that doesn't make news. That doesn't make a story. In a minute, I'd love to pitch it over to my colleague Annie, who's done some looking into what happened in Massachusetts when they passed their high earners tax, because the empirical evidence there is I think useful. But you mentioned Howard Schultz before, and I think it's an instructive example, because buried in his post about the fact that he not was leaving Seattle but had already left was, I think, a very important piece of information, which is that all of his children live on the East Coast, and that's also where he grew up. And he is choosing to move back closer to all of his children. And the reason I bring this up is that rich people make their decisions about where they want to live for the same reasons that the rest of us do. They want to be part of a community. They want to be part of, their neighborhood. They want to be part of they have their doctor here. They have trails they like here. They're near their kids. They're near their parents. They're near their friends. Yes, there is obviously some degree to which tax policy matters on the margins, but if you're someone for whom tax policy is driving where you're going to live, you are right on the edge of not living here anyway. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when we hear about these kinds of conversations, that there are a lot of things that go into the choice of where to live for everybody, and tax policy is just one of them. Before I pitch it, Danny, the other thing I'll say is, as someone who worked in housing and homelessness for years, I continue to be frustrated that we get 30 inches of column space put towards will rich people leave, and very little put towards the people who are priced out of the state day after day, month after month, and year after year because they can't afford housing, because they can't afford childcare, because they can't afford healthcare, and they need to move somewhere else where they can. That is a genuine migration that is happening in this state right now, and is not one that we're attending to particularly well. Annie, what would you add from Massachusetts?
Well, I can put a link to a blog that just provides actual data on the fact that you're not seeing millionaires migrate out of Massachusetts after they passed a very similar high earners income tax. But the other thing I'll add locally is that we saw the same reaction after the capital gains discussion, right? And since we passed capital gains in Washington State, we have seen massive increases in wealth holding, in the number of millionaires. So we can look to other states, and I'll put this really helpful kind of blog piece in the chat, but we can also look to our own state and see, oh, this actually didn't happen before here in Washington State. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just bring voice to the chat too, where Whit said, a similar comment to Ryan. I think, more concerned about poor people leaving the state, right? And that's not getting enough attention. Where's the media conversation on that? A great point. Thank you. And I'm going to play a quick clip. If this works, we'll see if I can manage the audio on it. But to kind of get to our next point, because the other piece of this question is a bit about, where does the money come from? And Christine brought that up in her comments about, like, how do we think about where we do need to move money. How do we actually do that effectively? So I'm going to see if this will work, and I'm going to play a quick clip of a forum with our mayor, Katie Wilson, trying to talk about this issue. Get some reactions.
I wouldn't even say that I'm a Marxist, but I think that, okay. Although I think that anyone who calls himself a Marxist today has to be able to explain very clearly, like, what are those fundamental aspects of Marxism that remain relevant, right? Because obviously things have changed a lot since, the 1860s or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I think, okay, here's what I will say. I will say that I think if you look at the kinds of labor that our society needs human beings to perform over time, the kinds of work and the kinds of production that, like, the market really excels at are getting more and more efficient, more and more automated. The kinds of things that we really need human labor for are like healthcare, education, combating climate change, really collective projects, things that ideally are funded collectively, publicly. They're not things that make a profit. And so I think this is going to, I think it already is, but I think it's going to more and more create this problem for us, where the way that our current economy works, the public sector and the things that we fund collectively and publicly They kind of have to be funded by like siphoning money off from private sector activity that generates profit. And I think we have this growing imbalance where it's harder and harder to make a profit except through kind of like speculation and doing things that really should be funded publicly, but doing them for profit. But the things that we need to fund publicly and collectively are growing and growing and growing, and our ability to fund those by siphoning value off profit-making activity, it becomes harder and harder. So that's a little bit of a big theoretical explanation, but
well, actually, no. Let me follow up here. Here, I thought we were going to talk about housing, but this is far more interesting.
I wasn't prepared to talk about this, by the way. So,
when you say things that should be publicly funded, those public funds come from somewhere.
Yeah.
So how ultimately is that different than, as you say, siphoning a percentage of profit from a capitalist system?
Well, that's the way that we do it now.
Yeah,
right?
so are you recommending that some other different...
Yes.
What would that be? Where would the money come from?
I mean, socialism, this is why it requires a really fundamental restructuring of life and work and, the role of money or what money actually functions as. I don't have a blueprint, okay, but...
So I'll pause it there. But the point of the clip was really to get to this, question. And our, Mayor is obviously at the forefront of getting asked these questions right now of like, if we're not worried about, big money leaving, then yeah, how do we actually, address this question of where does the money come from? And yeah, what should be our approach if we know we need capital to build the things we need, if we know we need public funding for ongoing services, education, how do we move money without reinforcing inequalities, et cetera? Any initial reactions to that? How would you have answered that question? What is the blueprint? Not to put you two on the spot either, Christine or Ryan. We don't have too much time left, but we'd also welcome reactions from anyone else as well.
I'll just say it as former EOI board member, Mayor Katie Wilson. And I'm curious what everyone else on the call thinks. So I'll just say it's really nice to have a mayor who thinks in complete sentences and paragraphs and is sort of engaging with questions on this level.
For sure. I guess what I would say is I see there's sort of the near term, which is what we're working on right now. How do we create a better right now we have these big piles of money and then people who are homeless on the street. How do we carve off what we need from the big piles to create some shift, and ideally, at least in my mind, help build the infrastructure so that more of the economy is taken up by or is being served by enterprises that by design are serving community needs better. It doesn't mean, I think at the end of the day, there are always going to be public benefit activities where profit is not, we don't want to work on it in the way that we work on it now, which is that somebody has to make a profit on it. That said, when you look at the Mondragon system, all of those businesses that are worker owned, there's a line item in their, in their cost structure that is, you can call it a tax if you want, but essentially it is to fund the ability for that system to continue to grow and sustain and serve more of the community and the economy in that region. And so over time, the idea that how do we do it in a way that rebalances inequities or limits the inequities? If it's those businesses that are supporting those things and they're structured in a way where the inequities are dealt with, then that money can go toward those enterprises or those activities where it doesn't make as much sense for even a private, a worker-owned co-op, which is still a private enterprise, to do those things. I also think there are a lot of things that are currently need to be publicly funded could be supported through smaller, less concentrated structures, right? I mean, look at the energy systems, for example. There's an argument that we'd be much more resilient if we all were on microgrids instead of our current system, for example. So those are my thoughts sitting from my living room in Howard. This is where we'd like to go. I would like to see it.
Yeah, so I think that interesting like, question of scale and scope, like at what scale do all these things happen as well, right? Yeah, we only have a couple minutes left, but maybe I just open it up for any other comments, given we're kind of limited on time for questions. Any other comments folks want to make on this question? Or any other questions if they're quick ones, I guess.
I would suggest that a lot of what you led with, Ryan, was the architecture of our systems that have not evolved to taxation. And I think there's a lot of architecture on both sides of the equation, both on the revenue and the expenditure side of government that have not evolved. And I think, to be taken seriously in our critiques on the revenue side, we have to be as discerning and of the expenditure side. I think sometimes we lose credibility because we don't critique ourselves.
That's good. Well, I think we're about at time unless any last word. I want to really thank Ryan and Christine for stepping up to these huge questions and trying to wrestle with them and doing so, with such thoughtfulness and grace. We're going to continue to wrestle with hopefully these questions and the different tensions that as we kind of try to move towards our vision of a better economy. So we'll keep it going. Continue to see the intersections between this kind of policy tax work and the economic development, community wealth building work. Collaborative governance is all part of one vision in my mind. So we got to work on it all at once. I want to thank you for joining everyone for the comments as well, for the poll. And we hope to see you at our next lunch lab in a month or two. So thanks so much.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.
everyone.